Good afternoon, and welcome to a new series of webinars from the American School of Classical Studies here in snowy Athens. I'm Jenifer Niles, the director of the school, and I am here with Professor Dimitris Plantzos of the University of Athens. Together, we have organized a series of 7 lectures on the topic of ancient painting in Greece, beginning today with the Bronze Age in Crete and extending in time to include Roman frescoes at Corinth. The purpose of this series is to explore how paintings relate to and are informed by the archaeological context in which they were found. However, we need to start off by saying that compared to more durable architecture and sculpture, painting is exceedingly rare in ancient Greece. Wall painting only survives well under exceptional circumstances, like the eruption of the Thyrian volcano, which buried the Bronze Age Aegean site of Akrotiri, or in frescoed tombs, which were encased in earthen mounds. We have a much larger body of ancient paintings from Italy, where the famous eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD buried so many country villas and townhouses, whose rooms were highly decorated with pictorial programs from floor to ceiling. When these Roman paintings were first discovered in the first half of the 18th century, they were removed from their walls and exhibited in the Naples Museum, devoid of their context. Here's an example from Rome, the famous Odyssey frescoes. They were discovered by chance in 1848 when the city began constructing an apartment block on the Cispian Hill. They were given to the Pope and put into gold frames to be exhibited, like famous Old Master paintings, in the Vatican Museum, where you can see them today. However, what you see is only the upper part of the room. The wall paintings were originally much larger, and there were many more of them. Over the years since their discovery, scholars have debated the painting's style, iconography, dating, and attribution, but little attention was paid to their context until 150 years after their discovery. In an important article published in 1998, the Italian archaeologist Filippo Corelli, for the first time, pulled together all the evidence: epigraphical, there were a few fragmentary inscriptions, topographical, and archaeological. This way, he was able to establish the original location and size of the complex, the number of paintings, and their date, and even the likely owner of the villa. This article is a brilliant demonstration of how every bit of contextual evidence must be scrutinized in order to fill out what is often an incomplete, or in this case, never published excavation. The citation to his article is in the chat if you want to read it. Thus, context matters a great deal if we are to obtain a complete understanding of the cultural, social, religious, and political roles that painting played in any ancient culture. I now turn to Professor Plantzos to say a few words. I'm delighted that he has agreed to partner with us in this webinar series, especially since he is the author of this beautiful and learned book on ancient Greek painting, published by Kapon in 2018.
Professor Niles, it is a great pleasure to be here with you today in the school's virtual auditorium for the inauguration of what I hope will prove a very interesting and highly attractive webinar series. So thank you, Jenifer, for kindly asking me to co-moderate these webinars with you. Let me also welcome our audience and assure everyone listening in today that our aim is to offer an intriguing series of case studies on the form, the uses, the functions, and applications of painting in ancient Greece, as well as its interaction with its viewers and users. Before then introducing today's speaker, let us remind you that next week, on Thursday the 25th, Dr. Chariklia Brekoulaki of the National Hellenic Research Foundation will offer us a paper titled In Search of Context, the Wall Paintings of the Messenian Palace at Pylos Revisited. So now I would like to ask Professor Niles to introduce today's speaker.
It is now my pleasure to introduce the first speaker in our series, Professor Emilia Oddo, who teaches Greek archaeology at Tulane University. Professor Oddo is no stranger to the American school. She was the recipient of two of our most coveted fellowships, appropriately that named for Emily Vermeulen in 2010, and the next year the Thompson Fellowship. She earned her PhD at the University of Cincinnati in 2016, writing on the Neopalatial ceramics from the site of Myrtos Pyrgos in southeastern Crete. She is the co-editor of two books dealing with this region, one published by Instap in 2019, and another forthcoming entitled South by Southeast, The History and Archaeology of Southeast Crete from Myrtos to Katozakros. More recently, she has turned her attention to Knossos and the famous House of the Frescoes with its blue monkeys, which is the subject of her talk today. Her work will be published in a forthcoming supplementary volume of the British School at Athens. We now turn the webinar over to Emilia Oddo, who will kick off our series of lectures on ancient Greek painting. We welcome your questions posted on the Q&A tab and hope to answer as many as possible at the end of our presentation when Professor Plantzos will be our moderator. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and kalispera, seolus, buonasera for all those people in Europe, and here in the United States and Canada, I guess it's good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. It is a real pleasure to be here with you today, although virtually, kickstarting this webinar series. And before I start, I would like to thank both Jenifer Niles and Dimitris Plantzos for inviting me to speak here and also for their assistance throughout the organization of this event. The topic of this talk branches off my current research on the Minoan House of the Frescoes in Crete, at Knossos, a project that I started with the collaboration of Vassophotou back in 2017, with the permission and support of the BSA in Athens, which I thank. Arthur Evans, the excavator of the House of the Frescoes, named the building House of the Frescoes for the impressive deposit of fresco fragments found within it. Impressive in quality, they are considered some of the finest examples from Knossos, and impressive in quantity, over 540 fragments, some part of the same composition, a rare wealth. Animals, nature scenes, marine scenes, abstract motifs, painted architectural decoration. These frescoes are famous. A few reconstructions of the scenes are on public display in the permanent exhibit of the Archaeological Museum in Heraklion and have been regularly featured in the studies of Bronze Age wall painting, especially the composition with the monkeys and birds that you see on your right, which also served as the backdrop of Pete de Jong's irreverent caricature of Evans himself. The iconographic analysis of these frescoes, in part explored by Mark Cameron and by Anne Chapin, whom I thank, promises to provide clues to the significance of these images for the spaces they once decorated. But I am not a fresco specialist, I am a pottery specialist, and I will not venture today in an iconographic study. Instead, in this talk, I would like to use these frescoes beyond their iconography, from their archaeological perspective. You see, these frescoes and their archaeological context represented a turning point in my study of the House of the Frescoes, as they allowed me to piece together the history of the building. Iconography aside, the study of these frescoes was that important. And this story is precisely the subject of my talk. So let's take a step back and introduce the House of the Frescoes. This is a Neopalatial building, which is between the 18th century and the 15th century BCE. It was excavated by Arthur Evans and Duncan Mackenzie, that you see both in the picture, in less than 3 months between May and July of 1923. It is located in prime position, only a few steps northwest of the palace and south of the Royal Road, which is this red line that you see on the slide. An elite structure made in ashlar masonry with limestone blocks and some gypsum, a freestanding building with an open-air plaza here on the west facade and a large open-air space, possibly also on the east, and with easy access to the Royal Road, a major branch connecting the palace to various other parts of the settlement. It was built in Middle Minoan 3B and abandoned in either late LM1A, late Minoan 1A, or early LM1B. What is important to know, it's a one-phase only structure, which presented no signs of burning, no violent destruction. It was just abandoned. Then, soon after, it started to be robbed of its building materials. Facade blocks were removed, and likewise, the room's floor revetment. Rooms F and H are the only well-preserved rooms where at the time of the excavation, one could still see door jambs, floor revetment, colorful lime plaster still attached to the walls. This pillaging went on for a while, because no other building ever superimposed the House of the Frescoes. Nothing was built on top until around the end of the Bronze Age, probably after the collapse of the palace. This small little elite building is a bit unusual. It has only a ground floor. Evans conjectured an upper floor, but the architectural analysis proves otherwise. A one-floor only building is uncommon in Neopalatial architecture, more typically organized in multiple stories. Moreover, the internal organization consists of 9 rooms from A to JK, but with a strictly controlled circulation pattern, forcing the visitor on one path, from the entrance into room A, through room C, then D, and finally, going up a couple of steps into the 2 most important rooms physically at a slightly higher level, rooms F and H. Once there, there's no other way out except that going back through the same path through which you came in from. Such a strict control, again, is unusual, at least in regular houses. And then there's the deposit of frescoes, which, given the size of the building and its state of preservation, must have come as a big surprise. The frescoes were not found on the walls of the building. They were found stacked. At least 34 layers of colorful fragments carefully stacked across the east end of room D. They formed a deposit about 3.5 meters long and 1.50 meters wide. The excavation came to a halt to concentrate on the meticulous removal of the frescoes without compromising their integrity. Evans noted that it was, and I quote, a long and arduous work, end quote, which took over 5 weeks and ended with no less than 84 trays of fresco fragments, quite a large amount for such a small building. The picture of the excavated stack on the slide is the only surviving photograph from the entire excavation. The stack, which in the photo appears like a blurry mass of fragments, rested on the floor level of room D. Somebody took all of these frescoes down, 84 trays worth of fragments, and stacked them. What happened to these frescoes? Why were they placed there? When and by whom? Lots of questions. And of course, the ultimate one, were these frescoes originally part of the House of the Frescoes decor? I will address each one of these points during this talk, so bear with me. Before we dwell on these crucial topics, let's take a closer look at the frescoes themselves. The stack includes fragments with a variety of subjects, though predominantly figurative, that is, representing living beings. Some fragments do not join into larger compositions, and we have no idea at the moment how they relate to each other. There are fragments portraying natural landscapes, like flowers, waterfalls, birds. Others have marine themes, like the ones on the slide showing an Argonaut, the one on top, and a view of the seabed. And stylistically, they all fit well with what is known of the Neopalatial fresco production. The vibrant colors are all well preserved. Several fragments can be joined together, and scholars have been able to reconstruct two different scenes. The first one, that is the one that is the manifesto of this lecture, shows blue monkeys and blue birds in a lush natural landscape on a deep red background. It is the most famous wall painting from the House of the Frescoes. A long frieze, about 5 meters long, with a clear narrative. It's a moment of chaos with monkeys carrying the birds. This is a bird, forcing them to flee, hunting among papyri, hunting for their eggs. From an iconographic point of view, fresco specialists have repeatedly pointed out how the frieze has ritual connotation. For one, blue monkeys are a relatively unusual subject in Aegean wall painting. At Knossos, besides in the House of the Frescoes, they are seen in the palace, in the saffron gatherer frieze from the lower keep. This is a moment of quiet that is portrayed with humanized monkeys in stark contrast to the House of the Frescoes frieze. But that dichotomy, quiet and calm, seems to be common. In building beta in Acrotiri, we see blue monkeys energetically jumping around in a moment of chaos. But then in Zesty 3, still always in Acrotiri, we also see them in a moment of quiet when they behave like humans, playing the lyre, or as we see here, the monkey is offering crocus to a large seated female, the so-called mistress of animals. All around them, crocus and crocus gatherers. Besides Knossos and Acrotiri, blue monkeys are represented at Philakopie, but that's just about it. They seem often represented in connection with crocus and crocus gathering, and in an iconographic context that might have had a specific symbology, ritual, religious. Mark Cameron called it a religious overtone, which I like. And monkeys are not the only element potentially suggesting ritual. Chapin and Marinatos both emphasize the peculiar and unprecedented variety of plants and vegetation in the landscape surrounding the monkeys and birds. Plants and flowers blooming in different moments of the year appear together in the frieze. Although clearly frescoes are not intended to be handbook of botanical research, this variety is unique and interpreted by both scholars as, quote, a symbolic depiction of the ideal spring, and, quote, a supernatural fertility of the earth. This religious overtone continues if we look at the other composition from the stack, the crocus panel. Crocus again. It shows a field of crocus and undulated lines. It is estimated that the panel was slightly less than 1 meter high and about 1.5 meters long. In earlier reconstructions, the scene included the 2 wild goats in heraldic position on either side of an olive tree. A recent reevaluation, however, including the discovery of 14 additional fragments, suggested that there might not have been any goats, perhaps just a field of crocus or perhaps other animals. Hard to say. The presence of crocus, however, echoes the monkeys and the birds frieze. A smaller quantity of fragments depicts what at first appear to be non-figurative subjects, painted marks, that Evans originally identified as linearity signs. Surprising, given that there is literally no evidence of actual writing on the wall in the Bronze Age. Evans thought, perhaps, of a religious text written on the walls of the house. But however intriguing, this idea was almost immediately challenged. Scholars of linearity did not see recognizable signs of the painted marks. A pivotal interpretation was put forward by Cameron. He suggested that those linearity-looking signs were in fact preparatory sketches made by the artist prior to applying the final bright paint that is typical of other frescoes. The paint simply flaked off the surface of the fragments, perhaps due to humidity or other natural decay, revealing the preparatory step below. According to Cameron, similar lines could be seen in other frescoes just below the painted surface. For Cameron, in fact, the so-called linearity fragments could have been a composition looking much like the one of the monkeys and birds. If that is the case, then these were not at all non-figurative subjects, but might have been another elaborate figurative scene or more, in line with the others from the stack. Great. So we have a small building filled with substantial, rich painted scenes, all stylistically Neopalatial and therefore contemporary with the House of the Frescoes in its construction, use, occupation, and anything. But here start the problems. Two, most importantly, whether the frescoes belonged all or in part to the original wall decoration of the building, and when and why were they placed in the stack. Because we found the frescoes not on the building's walls, not in situ or any primary context, but stacked on the ground, and this requires explanation. Were these fragments removed from the building's walls and stacked in room D? Or were they dumped into room D from elsewhere, having thus nothing to do with the House of the Frescoes? One important point must be kept in mind when trying to address this issue. Mackenzie, upon excavation, observed that the lime plaster of the backs of the fragments matched the one from the building's walls. This observation obviously is crucial and suggests that yes, the fragments were from the building. Besides, I do feel that it makes little sense to think that people carried all these fragments in baskets, or how else, from one location nearby to dispose of them the way we found them stacked. Where would they have taken the frescoes from? What other building, aside from the palace, could have had such an elaborate decorative system? We don't have evidence for that. Must have been nearby, though, clearly. And why dump it here? It seems like a much more convoluted process than simply remove the frescoes from the walls and deposit them within the same, perhaps abandoned building. So I find no reason to doubt that the frescoes originally decorated the walls of the House of the Frescoes. But then, if they were, on which walls should we imagine them originally? This issue has been debated before, and it is tied to the understanding of the architecture of the building. Early on, Evans and many others after him reconstructed the building on 2 stories and assumed that, as in the other Neopalatial buildings, the frescoes decorated the upper floor, better lit. But we now know that that is not the case. There was no second floor. And although small, the building had plenty of wall space to accommodate the frieze, the panel, and much else. Shaw and Chapin argued that the monkeys and birds frieze was on the walls of room H, while crocus panel was on the northeast wall of room F. I do not have a precise opinion on this matter. I agree with Shaw and Chapin's reconstructions, particularly since room H appears to be one of the most important rooms of the building. On the other hand, however, room H is not the only suitable wall space. Rooms C and D, the largest rooms, also could have accommodated the frieze. Room D is particularly attractive as an option, since it was also the fresco's final repository. Another important issue linked to the study of these frescoes concerns their final deposition, which may have to do with the function of the building itself. Why, when, and how did the fragments end up stacked in room D? The removal and disposal of frescoes from an abandoned building in the course of being dismantled is in itself nothing special. As we shall see later, we have other dumps, including frescoes at Knossos. But the fact that the fragments were stacked and were not mixed with other types of debris makes this deposit unlike typical garbage disposal. Analysis of the formation process of the fresco stack reveals important information about the activities at the House of the Frescoes immediately after its abandonment, opening new perspectives concerning the relevance and function of the building for the Neopalatial and later community. 3 facts must be kept in mind to analyze the formation process of the stack. First, as we said, the frescoes were carefully arranged, not scattered. The stack did not include any other debris like architectural material or pottery. It was just fresco fragments. Second, the stack rested on the floor of room D, but a floor that was deprived already of its revetment and spilled over the stubs of the wall between room D and room F. Finally, the surface and colors of the frescoes are well preserved, something that Evans remarked on. Simply put, if this was just garbage disposal, how do we explain the fact that no other debris was found in the same deposit? How do we account for the well-preserved surfaces? And how can we be sure that the stack was deposited while the building was already abandoned? Could it have been deposited while the building was in use? In his excavation notebook, Mackenzie dealt with these issues and suggested 2 possible scenarios. In one, the stack was put together while the House of the Frescoes was still in use, stayed in place until the later disturbers started demolishing the building. In the other one, the stack was made shortly after the abandonment and the partial demolition of the House of the Frescoes. Evans agreed with the first scenario. For him, fragments were stacked while the House of the Frescoes was still in use, during the remodeling, perhaps. They were carefully placed inside a closet space, which he called Room E, separated from Room D by a thin partition wall. But there is no archaeological evidence for this wall, and so no Room E. However, imagining a separate area closed off for the stack made perfect sense. The closet would have been an ordinary part of the House of the Frescoes during its lifetime and would have kept the stacked frescoes out of the way and in place, and they were taken off the wall. Obviously, the fragments were useless as they could no longer be put up on the walls, and therefore they were removed before being thrown away. Then the building was abandoned. Later occupants of the area affected its preservation, and as a result of these disturbances, wall DF collapsed, the stack spilled over it. Although perfectly reasonable, this scenario has some problems. In particular, if the stack was really deposited while the building was still in use, how do we explain the stripped floor of room D on which the stack rested? If the building was still in use, then the stack would have been placed on the floor of room D with its floor revetment. And if the floor was dismantled afterwards, the stack would have been disturbed. Maria Shaw agreed with Evans and Mackenzie that the fragments were intentionally stacked. But like Evans, she too thought that the occupants of the building removed the frescoes, stacked them in room E, a closet, to dispose of them and possibly other type of trash, and then stopped using room E altogether. She had comparanda from Knossos to corroborate her theory. But again, there is no room E in the House of the Frescoes. The stack was left sort of in the open, in room D, not tucked away, not removed with other trash on the corner of the room. Cameron proposed a different scenario. He interpreted the stack as a heap, the somewhat accidental result of the progressive deterioration of the building. The frescoes, which in his view were originally on the upper floor, must have first fallen on the floor of the room they were in, maybe because of an earthquake. Then, as parts of the house started collapsing, The frescoes fell from the upper floor to the ground floor, ending up in room D and forming the stack. That is why, in his view, we are left with a lot of fragments and no big chunks of wall paintings. It was a consequence of these repeated falls. And as for the fact that the stack was preserved and not destroyed by later decaying of the building, Cameron proposed that just like the fragments fell from the upper floor, so must have other debris, or even the ceiling's wooden beams, which ended up covering and hence protecting the frescoes. Cameron clearly tries to cover all the bases and understand precisely what might have happened. But I see a couple of issues with this theory, besides the known lack of an upper floor, that is. First of all, if the fragments collapse from the upper floor, it is difficult to imagine that they would have formed the neat layers reported by the excavators. If that was the case, I would imagine more of a dispersed type of heap, like those from other parts of Knossos, where the fragments end up sort of all over the room. And if their fall was part of a collapse from above, then I would expect other debris intermingled with the fragments, which we have no evidence of in the notebooks of the excavation. In a way, the scenario painted by Cameron implies a sequence of uncontrollable natural events, falls from the wall into heaps, then from the upper to the ground floor, which I find incompatible with the carefully layered fragments in the stack described by the excavators. Moreover, thinking about the fragments in isolation, although perhaps the excellent state of preservation of these fragments could have been accidental, real luck, their thinness and the lack of attached masonry behind them strikes me as unexpected. Not the result of a seismic event causing destruction. To me, it suggests rather than the frescoes were sliced off. People sliced them off the walls. So what then? In my view, the analysis of the deposit seems to lead to a single scenario. I think Mackenzie's second scenario is the correct one, that the position of the stack must have occurred when the building was already partially in ruins. He was right. We can agree with him, I think. The stack was created within a partially dismantled house of the frescoes. The fragments, or rather whatever was left on the original wall paintings from the building, were carefully removed and piled in layers, perhaps in basket, as Photo has suggested before. The baskets would have kept the stack in position for a while. But then, if the house of the frescoes was so dilapidated, it's surprising that a stack of fragile frescoes was preserved. The frescoes would not have survived a collapsing building, particularly thinking about the collapse of the floor, the roof of the upper, which could have pulverized them. I think that the people who took down the frescoes addressed this issue. Even though the building was partially in ruins, the fresco stack was intentionally buried, thus literally removing the frescoes from sight and at the same time also preserving them and their colors. If all this happened after the building's abandonment, when the robbing of its building material had already started, then perhaps the burial, so to speak, was visible and could be left alone. So the stack could have remained relatively undisturbed till the excavation. Relatively is the key word here, because clearly with time and with the progressive decay of the building and the activity at the site, which includes new building popping up around the house of the frescoes, which are the blue walls that you see on the plan, and the yellow ones as well. And in Roman times, also the digging of not one but 5 wells in and around the house of the frescoes, which you can see in pink color on the plan. It is perfectly reasonable to see how the stack could no longer be kept in place and in position. Indeed, some later disturbance might have affected the deposit, causing, for example, the pile to spill over the wall stumps. Okay, so at this point, this proposed sequence of events explains how the stack could have been formed, but raises the questions of when precisely after the abandonment of the house of the frescoes was the stack put in place. And after we sort this out, we will get to the most important question, that is, why? As for a more precise timeline for the formation of the deposit, it seems reasonable to assume that at the time the stack was buried, the building was, yes, being pillaged, but not yet covered up by considerable amount of soil and debris. The rooms were not yet filled in. The walls were exposed. Some kind of circulation within the building was even possible. It would be challenging to imagine that people had to dig through soil in room D to create a space on the ground to place all of these fragments. Now, this information is important because we know that at the end of the Bronze Age, around LM3B or later, walls were built above the fill of room H and room C, marked in the red squares on the plan. We have nothing more than a couple of mentions, one in the notebook, one in the Palace of Minos, which were promptly, and then these walls were all promptly removed during the excavation. If these were above room H and room C, it means that these two rooms, at least, were already filled to a certain height. We must assume that by then, probably the largest part of the building was also filled with debris, not just rooms H and C. So the deposition of the stack in LM3 is improbable, unless we want to, again, think about significant digging in room D to place the stack. But why? No. Instead, the stack must have been placed at a date that is right after the abandonment of the building, but before the filling of the rooms, and therefore close to the period of occupation. I think that it might have happened during LM1B, in fact, which is a date corroborated by pottery analysis that shows that by then, disturbances had already affected the deposit significantly, but not involving huge deposits inside the rooms. But there is also another reason that may point to LM1B. And it has to do with the other questions we have. That is, why did they slice and bury these frescoes? When thinking about why, we need to consider the stack in terms of its nature. This is not a common pile of trash, and is not the way frescoes were discarded at Knossos. A quick research on the other known fresco heaps shows exactly how the stack from the House of the Frescoes is unique. Within the palace, fresco fragments were regularly found in the fields from various rooms. One famous example, which I give you here on the slide, is that of the dolphin fresco from the Queen's Megaron. In all cases, including the one of the dolphin fresco, it's clear from the notebooks that the fresco fragments were found scattered across the rooms or part of the rooms. And most importantly, they were intermingled with architectural debris. Those deposits, therefore, included scattered fragments, collapsed and thrown out, not fragments carefully removed and deposited, not stacked. The stack from the House of the Frescoes is not this type of heap. Neither architectural debris nor pottery was recovered in association with these fragments. The nature of the depositional processes that formed the fresco heaps in the palace and the fresco stack in the House of the Frescoes were quite different. Even if we look outside of the palace, the same holds true. Fresco fragments have been found in the field of other Neopalatial buildings. In the South House, a few fragments were found in the field of the Lustral Basin, and one fragment under the floor of the so-called lavatory. Even when we think about the very well-known buildings like the Caravanserai, which I'm showing you the Partridge frieze fresco. Well, the frieze was found among the debris of the stepped pavilion, mixed with other later material included. All of you fresco scholars and experts in the audience may have encountered neat piles of fresco fragments, just like the one of the House of the Frescoes. And if you have, please let me know. But when talking of Knossos, the stack in the House of the Frescoes is unique. Yes, frescoes are found regularly in fields and trash at Knossos, but only here they are found organized in a stack. To me, this proves the exceptionality of this deposit, not something that is typical or common practice, but an oddity. To me, this means that the stack represents a structured deposition, intentional, deliberate. So why would people do that? Was it convenient to stash the debris this way before continuing the demolition? Or is the burial of the frescoes symbolically significant? Let's consider a few scenarios. It is possible that right after the abandonment of the house of the frescoes, while people had begun dismantling the building, the frescoes were removed and placed in a stack out of the way so that they could continue demolishing the walls. In other words, perhaps the frescoes were in the way of people interested in the building blocks behind them. That may be a possibility, but it does not explain why these fragments were buried. Why were they so well preserved then? Perhaps one may say the burial was accidental, but then the absence of debris seems deliberate, not accidental. The scenario is not satisfying for me. Another possibility is that the removal, the stacking, and the burial of the fragments was deliberate. The burial of the frescoes ensures that the fragments are not destroyed any further. It removes them, but preserves them at the same time, while the building keeps on being dismantled. If so, there is little suggesting that this behavior was dictated by practicality. It rather suggests a meaningful action, perhaps for symbolic reasons that escape us. Perhaps in LM1B, or later, the community was okay dismantling an older building, even if an important one, but frescoes had to be taken down and buried. Frescoes may have denoted something important or respected by the community of Knossian of those later periods. I think this hypothesis is more probable than the previous one. If it seems somewhat far-fetched to you, I would like to add to our conversation what emerged from the analysis of the finds, especially the pottery, and their relationship to the architecture, because it shows how the burial of the stack was part of various activities that people carried out in order to protect certain parts and objects of the house of the frescoes after its abandonment. On the basis of the pottery analysis, it is possible to prove the rooms H and F, the two most important rooms from the building, were intentionally buried after their abandonment, and precisely in LM1B. In fact, at that time, people got into the building, left a few pots on the floor of room H, perhaps as part of some kind of ritual, and then buried room H and room F. That's another structural deposition. This is the reason why these two rooms are the best preserved from the building, as they escaped the aggressive dismantling of the rest of the house. They still have their floor and were found with painted plaster on the walls. This is also the reason why the pots on the slide are the only complete or mendable pots from the entire area of the house of the frescoes. Now, it is impossible to prove that the burial of rooms H and F was done by the same people or in the same period as the burial of the stack. But the two events must have taken place while circulation was still possible within the building. And they also appear mighty similar in meaning, wouldn't you agree? It's something that is, they're two of the same, both removed from circulation and hence protect two very important things from the building: the core spaces, rooms H and F, the precious wall painting. Photo study of the architecture suggests that this building was not a dwelling, not a house, but has some type of specialized function. Different scholars have remarked on the religious overtones of the frescoes. The two structured deposits post-abandonment flag the building as a special place for the local community. Could it be that the house of the frescoes had a religious function? Difficult to prove, sure. But if it was not important for the community, if it was just another building without a particular collective meaning, then why would the people in LM1B be so careful to remove the frescoes and bury them, to bury those two important rooms? It is possible, feasible, that both burials were visible and respected. Why going to such lengths for something that did not matter? In fact, I'm convinced that these structured depositions might have gone hand in hand also with the fact that nobody built over the house of the frescoes until the end of the Bronze Age, and hence centuries after the cultural context in which the house of the frescoes was built and buried. By then, perhaps the significance of this building and its treasures was over. It was the end of the palace, the end of the palatial culture of Knossos. And it is entirely possible that the House of the Frescoes is not the only case of intentional dismantling at Knossos or elsewhere. We just need to keep looking. As always, in every good story, we're left with more questions than answers. It's the nature of the field, in a way. But I hope to have shown you just how important these frescoes have been for the reconstructions of life and afterlife of such an interesting building. The stack and its treasures were the first and strongest point of departure in the recovery of the complex story of the House of the Frescoes. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this really, really fascinating, very lively exploration of a true archaeological mystery. Now, we have just under 800 participants at this point. Many, many questions, many comments in the chat. I don't think I will be able to monitor everything. But let me just start by saying that we all know that archaeologists, have this proverbial tendency to see rituals everywhere. Mm-hmm. But I think in this case, you are absolutely right, because the way you present so very convincingly your evidence, it's very difficult to think of a practical reason why this depositing would happen. And I must say, I was thinking from the very beginning when you started showing your find, I was thinking of those ritual relic translations, as we call them in ecclesiastic language. Removal of relics in ritual deposition somewhere else. Perhaps we read too much into this find, but it's really, really fascinating. Now, we have a few questions. Let me just start by something that might be an unfair question to you, because this was not the point of your talk at all. You keep talking of frescoes, but from what we know from other parts of the Bronze Age world, when we analyze wall paintings, they end up not being frescoes, but tempera painted
yes.
and dry. I know that, of course, Mark Cameron believed that they were frescoes, although his description of the technique was a bit in the middle of things. He wasn't. Mm-hmm. He was talking about frescoes as such, but in a sort of mixed technique. Of course, preliminary designs are crucial evidence for a fresco, but you get them on dry painting as well. Mm-hmm. Do you have any ideas on the technique? Any finds of your own?
No, I mean, to be honest with you, I've been using the word frescoes just because this has been,
the House of Frescoes, yes.
The House of the Frescoes. So let's talk about the frescoes. But I did not, you're right. I did not associate it to a specific technique. And I know that there's a debate about whether this is an actual fresco. It's not a buon fresco, etc., of the later period. And I don't doubt, that. I simply adapted the term that has been used generally in the literature ever since the naming of the building. But that's just about it.
Oh, also we should add that frescoes. We know this from the Romans, that they were able to remove frescoes from Greece and take them all the way to Italy, and Vitruvius says that. So, as Professor Marinatos, who is with us this evening, suggested, this might indicate a sort of art enthusiasm. Do you think that they took them down for a wall to make a collection, perhaps, as Professor Marinatos suggested in her comment?
It would be nice to, yes, it would be interesting, and this is something that one may think about. But if they were if it was artistic enthusiasm, then one would imagine that similar things could be seen elsewhere, unless we need to think about a very unique situation in which an individual really loved these frescoes and started slicing them down. But to me, it's easier to think about something that the community treasured in some way. Although, of course, there is no way to, disprove another theory clearly. It could be very well that Evans said that this is the cultured house of a middle class, of the burger class, the petty burger class, and cultured because this individual that he imagined living in the building created a treasure, a visual treasure all around himself or herself. Now, it is pretty obvious to us that the House of the Frescoes was not a dwelling. And frescoes, forgive me, wall paintings, let's just be clear.
Murals.
Murals. Wall paintings were not, the Mona Lisa in a way. They didn't play the same role. So I'm interested in the functional aspect that they might have had. But yes, to me, the collective meaning has some more than just they liked it.
Okay, so let's go to some of the questions from Antonia Stamos. Near what we were just saying, if the House of the Frescoes was a ritual building, was the removal of the frescoes a way to desanctify them, especially if they were placed in a specific order when they were stacked? And also, there was another question. I don't remember the person who put it. Were they stacked right side up? Do we know this? If they were stacked face up or down?
It's both. It's both, in fact. Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's an interesting question. The thing that just comes to me is the length of time and the effort that this must have taken to people. If you're desanctifying a building, then still this is a big enterprise. I don't necessarily think that, that's why I'm saying, it may be ritual, religious. I don't necessarily think that the LM1B people, whoever dismantled these frescoes and buried the rooms, meant necessarily because we love the House of the Frescoes, but because we somehow care of this building one way or another. So even if it is a desanctifying the building, well, we're still relating to that building in some format. So we're still paying attention to it. So it wouldn't bother me in any way. Again, you have to wonder how long it would take to do this. There's a lot of care that has been taken into dismantling, and the progressive dismantling is something in itself to be further analyzed. But it's this removal was.
Yeah, and also there is a suggestion in the comments about perhaps a ritual killing of the murals as artifacts, like we see in so much of.
Yes.
Let me go to another question from Rosalba Ciampi, I think. Have you looked into anthropological, modern, contemporary evidence of ritual preservation of images of religious cultural significance?
I have not, and this is a good point. I will. I hope to be collaborating a little bit with Anne Chapin on this, on this aspect, perhaps, and see a little bit more into the type of details, that this behavior, this frescoes deposition suggests may entail. I have not gone into that yet, and to be honest, for the publication of the book, the presentation of the frescoes was kept willingly, in a way, general, to allow for further, points to be raised.
There's another question here about these perceived tendency or habit of sealing rooms or functions or artifacts by Ulrich Thaler. He says, Elena Kardamaki has hypothesized in a PhD thesis on Tyrins that there is a chalky deposit at top parts of the palatial painted floors of the of the site might have been artificial as a deliberate post-palatial effort to bury the paintings. He personally does not necessarily think that this holds up, but it could be, he says, an interesting comparandum if true. So do you think we're getting there, getting somewhere with that?
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. Yes.
So the name is Elina Kardamaki, a recent thesis on the Western Staircase from Tiryns. Now, some of our viewers go back to those cultic uses. What is the evidence again for the ritual use of the building? Is it ex silencio or is it something?
It's a number of things. It's by exclusion, really. I would like to point out the ritual here. I'm using ritual, and I'm very aware that we all archaeologists jump to the, oh, I don't know what it is, therefore it's ritual. I don't mean it that way, but the structure of this type of structure, this type of plan, the plan of the building is very unusual. It doesn't have many comparanda at all, like especially because it's a one floor only, because of the forced path that you are. So this is unlike dwellings. So structurally, architecturally, it's already like a red flag. That's not a regular, let's just call it, this is a special or different building. So the dwelling issue, the aspect of dwelling, I would just exclude it. So it has to be something that has to deal with something else. And what? Administrative, we really don't have anything from there. Sure, we can say like nothing has been preserved, but that's always, that's hazards of archaeology. So because of the connection of, with the types of frescoes, with the burials, the structure, the positions, there is something that smells like ritual in that.
Well, I agree. Well,
I know. Yes, there is no ultimate evidence. Unfortunately, we didn't find a bunch of figurines sitting around like a libation table with there is a libation table from there, but again, it's in secondary deposition. So is it from there? Is it from elsewhere? So it's a little bit of several small clues that it's kind of a detective work in this case. That's a reasonable scenario to me, but yeah.
Well, I know you said that this is going to be beyond iconography, but there are some iconographical questions from our viewers, and I think I should give them some airtime. Now, one of our viewers has observed that this the processual sort of sequence of the murals themselves, this route through the house, does it perhaps suggest the significance of the building? Do we have a sort of a route painted on the walls that can be, and perhaps because we have a few questions about that, could you please repeat and summarize the bits of iconography we got from the frescoes?
Yes, so to be honest, we have some in situ, but it's in room H, and they are mostly architectural decorations, so like wooden beams or lines, abstract stuff. We don't have any of the figurative frescoes, wall paintings from the rooms. So the figurative fragments are all in the stack. So it is a guesswork, and the themes are all like natural themes. There's no humans. There is one fragment with humans, and it is called the Captain of the Blacks, but that was found in a much later deposit in a different room that has nothing to do, with the house itself. So the majority, all of the fragments from the stack are figurative, but include animals, so blue, the birds and the monkeys, and plants, and this variety of plants, crocus, a lot of crocus. So then it goes into the guesswork of where this could have hung, this could have been on which walls. If we agree that the blue monkeys and blue birds frieze goes into room H, and then the crocus panel goes into room F, then you have extra fragments, the marine fragments, the others that have to do with the natural landscape, that are left out somehow. We don't understand very well the relationship to the scenes that we know. So they may have filled other parts of the building. I envisage that this visual wealth, let's say, accompanied the visitor, and somehow instructed or suggested the nature of whatever was going on in there. This has been seen in other buildings, so it's not news. But to what degree and what other? I mean, the monkeys could have been in room C, in room D. We have zero ideas on which we can actually base a proper revelation of the activities there and the experience of this visual.
Could I just add a
Thank you.
question?
Yes. Can I also ask Jenifer how we're doing about time? Is it time to?
Yeah, we're okay on time. I just wanted to follow up on that. Is there any possibility that the marine frescoes could be part of a floor, the way we think that the dolphin fresco from Knossos, from the palace, was a floor decoration? So that would account for, using some of those fragments if they all don't fit in the house.
That would be fantastic, to be honest, especially for the seabed. Yeah. So fitting, with the, it would be great. We don't have it because there is no masonry behind this. There's not much of the masonry left behind that. It's very difficult to determine. But a closer look at the frescoes will be done, so the fragments will be then published and so forth in the second volume of the House of the Frescoes, so to speak, hopefully. We hope that to find more fragments, because a lot of this is also still in its infancy in terms of identifying all the fragments. There's so much in the storage and so little understanding of how they what belongs to what. So in a way, we're still relying on previous scholarship. So this can change, and perhaps we will find plaster floors that are decorated. That would be sensational, I think.
Now, I know you said that we don't have much evidence regarding this practice from elsewhere, but there are many questions regarding that. If this is a common practice at all. In Bronze Age Greece to dismantle, to bring a wall painting down, to keep it. Do you have any evidence about that from that?
Not in this way. I mean, to my knowledge, not in this way. To me, they were disposing of, they're throwing away, removing frescoes and throwing them away. That was yes, especially like outside of the buildings or inside, like demolishing, etc. That is okay. That's something very common. But stacking them in all these stacks, this is 34 layers we're talking. It's not just a few, tucked away. That's what alerts me as something different is going on. The peculiarity of this type of deposit, which I haven't found comparanda for. And if anybody out there is aware of some, I hope that you reach out, because that would be interesting to see. But yeah, that is the odd part. It's not just a disposal.
And we also have questions about the actual context. Is there a possibility at all of a table that would stand in that part of the room, and so the frescoes would be stacked on it or around it or under it?
No, we don't. We don't have anything like this. No, in fact, they were all. I mean, okay, we saw the blurry mass there, but ideally, in the words of the excavators, they were really sitting on the floor, and at the beginning, Mackenzie even thought that there was some kind of niche in which they were, because they must have stayed in place for a long time. And but yeah, no furniture, no idea. This building was found, besides all that, it was found empty. There was nothing inside, no objects, that really pertain to it, besides these two structural depositions. So tricky.
Very interesting. Talking about other instances of such practice, Panagiotis Kallios says that, or asks, whether there's the connection between what he understands is a case from Avaris in Tel Daba in Egypt, where he thinks that the wall paintings, the well-known Minoan wall paintings from there, yes, from that site, were taken down and deposited. So do you think, he asks, if there's a connection in some sort of political change or something like this?
Yeah, I've been thinking about Tel Daba too. To be honest, I am in the process of reviewing some of this. And I know that some of the, for example, the Toreadors, scene and so forth, but they were chucked away, though. They were outside of the building. At least part of that was outside of the building and was in fragments that were dispersed. I will look more into that, but to me that was already like a different thing, a different type of deposit. But perhaps there's more there to dig out and to connect. That would be great. we need comparanda.
Certainly. Two further technical questions. One, again, about the backs of the fragments. Mm-hmm. If there's any evidence of tool marks or backing from Chrysanthi Pantazis, this question.
That I don't know. Because again, I'm not a fresco specialist in a way, so I will be reporting from the pottery perspective, but I do know what the excavators said, and they couldn't see that. Again, like it needs to be revamped, and like a proper study of the back should be done. But I don't exclude it altogether. What's interesting is that all these fragments seems to have the same consistent trend. The backing seems to be all similarly removed. So it seems to be like one big operation. So tool marks, I would expect to find them, hopefully. Stay tuned.
Well, fingers crossed for that. And a related question coming to us through the chat by our friend Kenneth Lapatin. He's asking whether, and several other viewers ask the same thing. Can we say whether they were meant to be recycled? And he also mentions, Kenneth also mentions the case of the Romans who removed wall paintings from Greek walls and brought them back to Italy for mm-hmm. reuse. So do you think that they could be meant for recycling somewhere else in the settlement, but then they were just abandoned?
I don't know. The idea, Evans said that they sliced them down and they put them in the closet because then they were remodeling and perhaps putting them back up. But there was some kind of like hopeful ending that they were not just discarding them, because why would you put them in the closet otherwise? To my understanding is that they couldn't put them up, just it wasn't the way they were sliced or the way they were, the way it works, they wouldn't have been able to reattach them. But this being said, and then these were really, really thinly sliced. So again, like it's a problem of how to do it. But then again, like that would be a unicum. We don't have, to my knowledge, we don't have other similar reusage or recycling of the frescoes. That would be very interesting if that was the case.
You would need to frame them in wood like they did with the Boscoreale frescoes from Italy, now in New York and elsewhere.
Yes, and that might have been, but Evans thought that, suddenly the house was abandoned, and so this could not be continued. So it was like left abruptly. To me, it doesn't really feel like it was left abruptly. It was
right.
Close enough, but that's.
Going back to iconography, you can't escape from that. There's a question. There are many questions about the flora depicted on these and other mural fragments and murals from Crete and of course Santorini. Are they? You said that they're not actually naturalistic depictions of local flora, but do we know if they were used for medicinal purposes, religious purposes? I would add magic. Do we know anything about?
A little. We know about the crocus and the association, the sacred association of crocus, because also it's represented in many of the, the typical iconography. But what strikes me of this depiction is that, reading both Marinatos and Chapin, is that it seems to be really unique in the association of the different flora. The Minoans were no strangers to being very specific about what they put where in their frescoes, and they really like the variety, and they like to depict variety of flora. But it's interesting that here they have a bunch of all of them together. It's like the uniqueness of this, let's say, this composition is that there is an immense amount of variety that usually we see individually here and there, but not all together. So perhaps this has something to deal with the particular function that might have been hinted, let's say, by the composition, which may have been magical. Sometimes the liminality in between these realms is very difficult to.
Certainly, yeah.
Right. So
magic and medicine go hand in hand, even
exactly.
in the first millennium.
Exactly. Right. If there was some kind of urgent care, time.
Ulrich Thaler comes back with another Mycenaean example, which might interest you. There's a fresco dump in an abandoned tomb in Agios Vasilios on the Mycenaean mainland. He says he's not certain right now whether a chamber tomb or follows tomb, and the deposit seems to be in from above through the missing ceiling or vault, if he remembers correctly. He says. It doesn't look like stacking, but at least a vague comparandum in terms of an architecturally contained deposit, even if fully consistent with the assumption of opportunistic use of a convenient dump.
That's very interesting. Yes, thank you for that.
It's Agios Vasilios. How are we doing about time?
Well, I think we should wrap it up pretty soon, but we've gotten lots of comments and accolades. Everyone, many people.
Yeah, I don't even dare open the chat panel because it's full of thank yous and congratulations and hellos.
Yeah, so I think we should probably say goodbye or good night to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Emilia, Oddo, for a really exciting lecture and a challenging one. We don't really have all the answers yet, but we look forward to your publication. And we all hope that you will join us next week and for Dr. Brekalaki's talk, which will be on the frescoes from the Palace of Nestor at Knossos, which was an affiliated American school excavation done under the direction of the University of Cincinnati, still ongoing. This is the site of the famous Griffin warrior tomb, which was discovered a few years ago, but there are also other wonderful objects from Pylos, including these frescoes. So please join us next week, the same time, 7 o'clock here in Athens, noon in New York. And we will have another wonderful lecture in our series on Greek painting in context. Thank you all for joining us.